Law enforcement officials from New York, Massachusetts, and Maryland testified about efforts to combat the MS-13 street gang in local communities. MS-13 is a multinational gang which started in Los Angeles with members in major U.S. and Central American cities. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee is chaired by Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin.
This hearing will come to order. I want to thank the witnesses for taking time for your thoughtful testimony. I think it will be a pretty interesting description of a problem that I think plagues so many inner cities. And from my standpoint, really one of the contributing factors of this is one of the top priorities of this committee is securing our borders. This is what I think our 25th hearing on some aspect of border security. Now, the title of the hearing was Border and Security, the Rise of MS-13 and Other Transnational Criminal Organizations. Reading through the testimony, it looks like we're going to be focusing an awful lot on MS-13, which is, obviously in the news today. And I'll let the witnesses tell the stories, but it is kind of interesting, the history of MS-13. Originally formed out of immigrants coming from El Salvador, the war there, in California, Southern California area. And then, based on problems, those members being deported to Central America, the organizations grew and thrived in Central America, and now we're seeing them come back, sometimes in the form of unaccompanied children. I did send a letter yesterday as a result of information we received from a whistleblower. I sent it to Mr. Scott Lloyd, the Director of the Office of Refugee and Resettlement. And yesterday late breaking news, because of this hearing, we were informed by a whistleblower of a Customs and Border Protection document from July of 2014 describing an incident. This was right at the height of the surge of unaccompanied children arriving at our border. And the documents appear to indicate the CBP apprehended the self-identified MS-13 gang members at the border. The CBP significant incident report dated July 5th, 2014, basically stated that officers assigned to the NPC, that's the Nogales Placement Center, identified multiple admitted MS-13 gang members. Another document goes on to quote, all identified gang members at the Nogales Placement Center have been placed in the appropriate placement center and are no longer being held at the NPC, the Nogales Placement Center. 16 identified juvenile gang members were transferred to placement centers around the country, including Shenandoah Valley Juvenile Center in Virginia, Selma Carson Staff Secure in Washington, Nova Staff Secure in Virginia, the SWK Mesa Staff Secure in Texas, Children's Village, New York, and Fort Sill Army Training Center in Oklahoma. Now, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, within the Department of Health and Human Services, was responsible at that point for the care and custody of UACs apprehended by CBP. Now, why do I point that out? We've got a broken system. It was in 2002 in the authorization of the Homeland Security, we split out the responsibility where now CBP apprehends, processes, but then turns unaccompanied children over to HHS. And we've gotten very good at apprehending, processing, and dispersing, which from my standpoint has just fueled this rise in unaccompanied children coming to the border. Certainly during the last administration, just so we understand what we're talking about when we say unaccompanied children, because I know immediately people think of, little children, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. I mean, here are the facts. Out of 188,000 unaccompanied children apprehended from 2012 through 2016, and that includes from Central America as well as Mexico, because it's only broken out with that, so it's not just Central America. 68% of those unaccompanied children were 15, 16, or 17. In other words, prime gang age. By the way, 68% were also men. Less than 18% were under the age of 12 or under. So the fact of the matter is, so many of the unaccompanied children are literally young men, prime gang age, and now we have documentation from whistleblower that CBP apprehended them, knew they were MS-13 gang members, and they processed and they dispersed them into our communities. So again, I think the purpose of this committee is to highlight these problems within our government agencies, within our government laws and procedures, to make the public aware so we can actually keep this homeland safe. So again, I appreciate the witnesses coming here to testify. We'll describe the danger, the problems with MS-13, the barbarity, and that's what this committee is all about, is holding these hearings to raise that public awareness, lay out a reality so we can actually enact public policy to combat it and keep this homeland safe. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing. There is nothing more important than getting these criminals behind bars. Nothing. And if we have in fact in any way allowed criminals to come into our country, then there is complete agreement, I believe, on every member of this committee that we need to do everything we can to apprehend them and catch them. I want to begin by recognizing the three witnesses here today and such respect for what you do every day. I know firsthand from my time as a prosecutor that people that wear the uniform in law enforcement in this country go to work every day not thinking about themselves, but thinking about what they can do to protect, what they can do to make sure that families are safe in their communities. And they take a great deal of risk in doing so. So I know your job is sometimes thankless and it's easy for folks to criticize you, but I just want you to know from the depth of my person how much I respect what you do every day. Gang violence is certainly a huge problem in this country, and it's tearing apart families and taking the lives of way too many. They prey on the weak, they prey on the vulnerable, they provide a sense of family that many times young people have never had, and they do irreparable damage, not just to the lives of their victims, but also to the communities where they live. Today, we're here to discuss one gang in particular, MS-13, a gang that was started in St. Louis in the 80s, and in Los Angeles in the 80s, and has since expanded to Central America. You know, I want to recall the feeling of hopelessness I used to have when I was the prosecutor in Kansas City, and we had a huge gang problem, when we would be confronted with horrific violence that was gang-inflicted, and we couldn't get anybody to talk. I remember sitting and crying with victims and explaining that if no one talks, no one goes to prison. And that's why these gangs are so insidious. Not only do they do violence, but they also, by the way they commit violence, they discourage anyone from ever speaking up in ways that can hold them accountable. And that's why I'm troubled that we've seen a recent trend in some places, even fewer people willing to come forward in communities that are full of people who have come to this country looking for hope from another country. And I certainly want to protect our borders. I certainly want to secure our borders, but we also have to be cognizant that what we say and do has an impact on people's willingness to come forward. And then you exacerbate that with the fact that they're going to come forward against gangs, then we give you an absolutely impossible job to try to hold these gang members to the standards that we demand, and that is putting them in prison for as long as we can possibly put them there, and in some instances, seeking the death penalty. So because of my sensitivity about how hard it is to get these guys, I just want us to be very careful about documents that are released, because sometimes information about individuals is very sensitive. Even documents that the committee got a hold of last night. These documents did not come from CPB, they came from a whistleblower, which we want to encourage whistleblowers. But we also have to be very cautious if there's sensitive information in any of these documents, that they have been fully vetted and that law enforcement in those communities who may be working investigations as we speak about some of these individuals, that there's nothing that in any way is released that could ever harm any of those investigations. Putting these people in prison is way more important than this hearing. And so I have concerns that these documents were released so quickly and that we didn't have a chance to even view the documents on our side of the aisle until they had already been released as now part of the public discourse on this issue. So I understand the concern, and I share the concern, but I think we've got to be careful and cautious, because at the end of the day, we got to make sure we're supporting you. And that is the most important thing that we have to do. So I look forward to your testimony, and I look forward to asking questions about the challenges you face in getting these gang members that are wreaking havoc in so many communities across the country.
Thank you, Senator McCaskill. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you all rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is Mr. Timothy Sini. Sini, okay, sorry about that. Police Commissioner Sini serves as a police commissioner for Suffolk County in the state of New York. Prior to his appointment as commissioner, he served as the assistant deputy county executive for the public safety in the same jurisdiction. Commissioner Sini.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the chairman and all the members of the committee for the opportunity to provide testimony today regarding MS-13 in Suffolk County, New York, and ways in which we can work together to effectively eradicate this gang from our communities. Just briefly, Suffolk County is New York's 4th largest county, situated some 20 miles east of New York City, covering 911 square miles and 1,000 miles of coastline on the eastern end of Long Island. Suffolk is comprised mostly of suburban communities with a diverse population of approximately 1.5 million people. The Suffolk County Police Department is one of the 15 largest police departments in the country, with approximately 2,500 sworn officers and approximately 1,000 civilian employees. Contrary to, sure.
Stop you. Is your microphone working? Or can we turn up the...
The green button is on. Sure. Contrary to recent sentiments in the national media, thanks to the hardworking men and women of the Suffolk County Police Department, Suffolk remains one of the safest counties of its size in the United States. Presently, crime is the lowest it's been since we've been collecting reliable crime statistics in 1975. Despite these historic reductions in crime, we've recently experienced an increase in gang violence connected to MS-13. Specifically, since January 1, 2016, of the 45 homicides that occurred in Suffolk County, 17 of those are believed to be linked to MS-13, which is approximately 38% of all homicides during that time period. And since 2013, 27 murders in Suffolk have been attributed to MS-13. Suffolk County has approximately 400 identified MS-13 gang members organized in cells called cliques. Many of these cliques have connections to other jurisdictions, including our neighboring county, Nassau County, and New York City. Active MS-13 gang members are predominantly male and range predominantly from the age of 16 to 29, and the median age of MS-13 recent arrestees is 18. In Suffolk County, MS-13 engages in a variety of criminal activity, such as assaults, murder, drug dealing, extortion, robberies, and burglaries. Intelligence indicates that many MS-13 gang members hold wage-paying jobs and are not focused primarily on income-generating crimes such as drug dealing, differentiating them from the typical street gang. Rather, MS-13 often engages in violence for the sake of violence, to increase the notoriety of the gang and to cause communities to fear the gang and its members. In fact, in 2016, the most frequent reported crime committed by MS-13 was assault. The signature weapon used by MS-13 is the machete. As noted, however, MS-13 members also commit murder, often targeting victims who they perceive as disrespecting the gang. For example, in September 2016, MS-13 gang members brutally beat 2 young girls to death in a suburban cul-de-sac, Nisa Mickens and Kayla Cuevas. Nisa and Kayla were 15 and 16 years old. They were high school students. Shortly before her murder, Kayla had a schoolyard argument with an MS-13 gang member. In collaboration with the FBI's Long Island Safe Streets Task Force, the Suffolk County Police Department arrested their murderers, and they are currently being prosecuted by the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. In response to the heinous acts of MS-13, the Suffolk County Police Department launched a gang eradication strategy targeting MS-13, which to date has resulted in over 200 MS-13 arrests of more than 150 individual MS-13 gang members. Our strategy is as follows. We collect a tremendous amount of intelligence on the gang with the specific objective of identifying MS-13 gang members and hangouts, and assign police officers to specific gang members to aggressively and relentlessly target the members and the locations where they frequent. This targeted enforcement suppresses crime, results in the collection of intelligence, and generates valuable evidence for federal prosecutions down the road. As we engage in this targeted enforcement, we are working hand in hand with our federal law enforcement partners to strategically select MS-13 gang members for federal prosecution under the RICO statute, which is a very effective tool to dismantle gangs such as MS-13. We recognize, however, that targeted enforcement as well as enhanced patrols will not alone lead to the eradication of MS-13 from our communities. As law enforcement weeds out gang members from our neighborhoods, we need to invest in school-based and community-based programs to reduce gang recruitment and gang enlistment. MS-13 preys on our most vulnerable, young people, and if we do not provide the structure for these young people, MS-13 will. To this end, we use an arsenal of community-based intervention strategies, such as custom notifications, call-ins, youth conflict insertions, and we also work closely with our schools to identify at-risk children early on to intervene in effective ways to prevent them from joining gangs or to assist them in getting out of a gang. One specific segment of our population, particularly vulnerable to gang recruitment, is our unaccompanied children, known as UACs. From 2014 through March 2017, 4,624 UACs have been placed in Suffolk County alone, making it one of the largest recipients of UACs in the country. While the vast majority of these children are good kids seeking a better life in the United States, they are vulnerable because they are young, unaccompanied, adjusting to a new country, culture, and language, and seeking a sense of belonging. And some of them do not have the structure or support system in place to help their transition. Due to these circumstances, we have seen a small percentage of UACs fall victim to gang recruitment and gang victimization. In sum, while the vast majority of UACs live law-abiding lives, the vulnerability of some of these children creates a source of recruitment for MS-13, and we must provide necessary support to these kids, or MS-13 will. To highlight ways in which the federal government can further assist local governments on this critical public safety issue, I respectfully suggest the following. More federal prosecutors to prosecute RICO cases against MS-13 gang members. For example, we work with the Long Island Criminal Division of the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, and they have only 11 line assistants and 4 supervisors, despite the fact that districts with comparable or smaller populations have significantly more AUSAs. Indeed, if provided with sufficient AUSAs, the Suffolk County Police Department could launch a pilot program in collaboration with the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office, whereby every MS-13 arrest could be screened for possible federal prosecution. This would increase the number of federal prosecutions of MS-13 gang members, taking dangerous individuals off our streets, and likely generate significant intelligence due to the incentives in the federal system for defendants to cooperate with law enforcement. Second, improved intelligence sharing among law enforcement agencies throughout the country, perhaps by creating a singular database with information relating to identified MS-13 gang members. This system could include automatic notifications to local agencies when information is added regarding an individual who is of interest to that agency. Such a database would encourage multi-jurisdictional operations and allow local police departments to be more proactive in targeting MS-13 gang members in our communities. Third, additional federal funding to offset patrolling costs associated with hotspot policing in areas affected by MS-13 activity. Fourth, additional federal funding to fund gang prevention and intervention programs tied directly to the number of UACs placed in our communities, as they are some of the most vulnerable to MS-13 recruitment. And lastly, improvements to the UAC program, including but not limited to increased screening and compliance monitoring of sponsors, notification of placement to school districts and local governments, and increased funding for post-placement services. In closing, I want to thank the committee for its time and its commitment to this very important issue, as well as the opportunity to appear before it today. I look forward to working with the committee and all its members and its staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Our next witness is Detective Scott Connelly. Detective Connelly is the lead investigator for the Chelsea Police Gang Unit in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Detective Connelly has been serving the public for over 22 years, including serving as a task force officer in the Boston field office. Detective Connelly.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, and distinguished members of the committee. It's my honor to address you today on behalf of the citizens of Chelsea, Massachusetts. My name is Scott Connelly, and I've been a member of the Chelsea Police Department for over 22 years. To provide context for my testimony today, I've included a brief biography. I would highlight that I currently serve as a detective with the Chelsea Police Department's gang unit, as well as being a task force officer for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's North Shore Gang Task Force, which is funded by the Federal Safe Streets Initiative. Chelsea is a city in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. It's directly across the river of the Mystic River. As of 2017, Chelsea had an estimated population of 42,828. It is also the second most densely populated city in Massachusetts, with a total area covering just 2.5 square miles. Chelsea is a diverse, working-class city. It is one of only 3 Massachusetts cities in which the majority of the population identifies as Hispanic or Latino. Chelsea's residents enjoy a large and thriving Central American population. In 2014, our community, as well as surrounding cities and towns, experienced a significant increase in the number of teenage students entering the schools from Central America. For the most part, a large majority of these students were hardworking and in pursuit of the American dream. But there was a second type of student entering our schools as well, the MS-13 gang member, straight from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, with nothing but malice on his mind, looking to further the influence of his gang and to recruit as many of the above-mentioned children into the MS gang as possible. These children were entering our country across the southern border as unaccompanied children. They were coming to communities that had a strong Central American population in an attempt to be reunited with family members. Upon arrival to the Metro Boston area, they found themselves in a very vulnerable position. Some of these individuals, some of them being reunited with family members that they have not seen for 14, 15, and even 16 years. Some being reunited with mothers and fathers that have moved on and started their own families and didn't welcome the child to be part of it. And at worst, some of these unaccompanied children went into a sponsorship program where the so-called concerned adult had no interest in the child's well-being. As gang investigators, we know that this combination of breakdown in family structure and individuals wanting to belong and the child's thought that they were in need of protection makes that child a perfect candidate for gang recruitment, and in this case, recruitment by MS-13. I've been investigating the MS-13 gang in Massachusetts for over 15 years. Over the course of those years, I've seen the gang's membership numbers increase and decline. The most recent increase and the most significant increase began in 2014. The city of Chelsea, as well as surrounding cities and towns, saw an uptick in street-level violence associated with MS-13 and its rival, 18th Street. At first, this violence was isolated to mostly armed and unarmed assaults, but soon developed and evolved into coordinated attacks on rival gang members and students within our schools. Some of these attacks resulted in homicide. Homicide investigators have detailed the most brutal, premeditated, horrific crimes committed at the hands of MS-13. They are an organization that has no respect for human life. They kill on demand and without mercy. They often use cutting instruments like machetes, knives, and even box cutters to inflict the most damage on the victims as possible. This is how they spread their influence, this is how they intimidate, and this is how, if left unchecked, they can take over a community, or in the case of El Salvador, influence an entire country. In 2016, as a result of a 3-year investigation conducted by the North Shore Gang Task Force, an HSI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, charged 61 leaders, members, and associates of MS-13 in a RICO conspiracy involving 6 murders and 22 attempted murders. We don't view this investigation as a case, but rather of our MS-13 program. The multi-agency approach is critical to any successful MS-13 program. That program depends on closely coordinated investigative measures by a law enforcement team consisting of the FBI, specifically in Massachusetts, the North Shore Gang Task Force, HSI, the FBI tag offices in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the Massachusetts State Police, and various local police departments within communities containing a strong MS-13 presence. This program also requires close coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office and local district attorney's office. The multi-agency approach is critical to any successful MS-13 program. Also critical is an appropriate balance between criminal prosecution and deportation. To really get to the heart of the problem in the Metro Boston area, we needed to investigate and prosecute a high volume of MS-13 members, including the entire leadership. Along the way, we used deportation tactically to remove dangerous individuals whom we were unable to prosecute either because of age or inability to gather sufficient evidence. We work closely with our HSI partner to ensure that we are targeting the right individuals for deportation and providing HSI with the evidence it needed to ensure that the deportation would occur. Now that we have taken out a large portion of the leadership and membership, we continue a 3-part strategy consisting of developing human sources for continued large-scale criminal enterprise investigations and prosecutions. Using the intelligence, the sources we've developed for our prosecutions to assist local district attorney's offices and investigators in our case with 3 of 4 pending investigations, prosecutions of MS-13 murderers involving juvenile defendants. And 3, using deportation to disrupt MS-13 criminal operations. It takes a task force approach with the most sophisticated investigative techniques to combat a transnational threat. Each local, state, and federal partner offers a unique skill set to the team. It is my opinion that it is critical to mission success that these efforts are supported with efficient funding and appropriate recognition by the United States government. Thank you.
Thank you, Detective. Our final witness is Chief Police Thomas Manger. Chief Manger has been the Chief of Police in Montgomery County since 2004. Chief Manger began his law enforcement career in 1997 with the Fairfax County Police Department. Chief Manger.
Thank you. Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, distinguished members of the committee, my name is Tom Manger. I'm the Chief of Police in Montgomery County, Maryland. It is a community of 1 million people, 1/3 of whom were not born in this country. I'm also here representing as the president of the Major City Chiefs Association. That's an association of the largest 69 police departments in the United States. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to address the committee. Senator Johnson, Chairman Johnson pointed out that in his remarks that MS-13 has been around in the United States for over 40 years. They started on the West Coast. 10 years later, they started showing up on the East Coast. And since the time that they've gotten here, MS-13 has evolved into one of the most violent and murderous gangs in the world. It has progressed from a group whose members certainly in my jurisdiction, started off committing petty crimes and were initially considered as more of a juvenile delinquency issue as opposed to anything else, and now they've escalated into acts of extortion, aggravated assaults, and murders. As a result, my department and others in the Washington, D.C. region formed a dedicated investigative unit that are solely focused on gangs and continue to target MS-13 and other gangs. Over the last 20 years, my department, in partnership with our regional and federal law enforcement partners, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office, have prosecuted numerous cases against MS-13 and its primary rival, the 18th Street Gang. With each major prosecution, the county experienced a period of relative inactivity from the gangs, only to have them reemerge after reconstituting their ranks and reestablishing their criminal enterprises. Beginning in about 2 years ago, in June of 2015, Montgomery County began to experience a spike in gang-related homicides. This marked increase correlated with the breakdown of a truce between the gangs and the El Salvadorian government, and a significant increase in that country's homicide rate. This year, Montgomery County has not experienced and not seen a spike in those homicides by MS-13, but this is because we have just completed a major racketeer influence corrupt organization, RICO case, that the task force officers from Montgomery County and Prince George's County in the D.C. region and agents from the DEA and Homeland Security investigations conducted that netted several indictments of top Maryland-based MS-13 leaders. Coincidentally, we had two MS-13 gang members that were murdered in an altercation when an unidentified suspect at a local shopping mall got into a confrontation with them and stabbed both of the individuals to death. There was another highly publicized incident earlier this year where a 15-year-old runaway from my county was killed in a neighboring jurisdiction by MS-13 gang members and associates. This certainly reminds us that while we've seen a bit of a decline in the homicides this year, it reminds us that our work against gangs must continue. It's important to note that during this same time frame, my jurisdiction experienced 7 more homicides that were attributed to 2 other local gangs or crews. These murders by the neighborhood crews appear to be motivated by illegal drug transactions, whereas the MS-13 gang murders appear to be based on the victims' perceived or actual affiliations with rival gangs. Furthermore, committing a homicide is a means for gang members to elevate their status within the gangs. What also distinguishes the MS-13 murders is premeditation, brutality, and callousness in which they were committed, with many of the victims suffering from multiple blunt force trauma and stab wounds and left in shallow graves in isolated wooded areas. In addition to the homicides that I've mentioned, we've also heard from community members that MS-13, which historically extorted money from solely illicit businesses, such as bordellos and unlicensed cantinas, are now collecting rent from legitimate Latino business owners and residents in certain apartment complexes. In some instances, if the victims of these extortions refuse to pay the fee demanded by the gang members return with detailed information on the intended victims' family members still living in Central America. The victims here in the United States know that that threat of violence to their extended family in their native country is a true possibility and that the perpetrators are out of the reach of U.S. law enforcement. This same coercive tactic is used to get young adults to join gangs or do tasks on their behalf. The unaccompanied minors that come into our country are particularly vulnerable to gang recruitment. The gangs surf the internet, building dossiers on potential recruits, gathering information on their social networks, both here and back in their countries of origin. The data from the social media is then used to entice or coerce new prospects. In at least 2 of the recent MS-13-related murders committed in my jurisdiction, the victims were identified, targeted, and ultimately lured to their deaths after they developed fabricated social media relationships and accepted false invitations to meet with female MS-13 associates, posing on the internet with promises of having sex with the unsuspecting victims. Technology also plays a role in hampering law enforcement investigations against gangs and other transnational criminal organizations. In our recent case with the DEA and HSI, investigators learned that gang members were using commercially available encrypted apps to plot their criminal activities. These applications and other technologies are part of a growing, larger issue of criminal organizations going dark and exceeding the current abilities of both local and federal law enforcement to legally monitor their communications, even with a court order. I want to also mention that my colleagues in corrections have mentioned that there has been a marked and dramatic increase in the number of MS-13 gangs in our jails and prisons. This dramatic uptick in that population has impacted the ability for our corrections professionals to keep these individuals segregated. It's impacted staffing and the safety of corrections officers. Let me just finish by offering two recommendations to the committee to address this growing problem. First, I believe that Congress can and should fund federal, state, and local task forces to focus on gangs. They could be modeled after the Joint Terrorism Task Forces and should have a single national and coordinated infrastructure led primarily by a federal agency with significant input from local departments. These regional gang task forces will need the full spectrum of support, from centralized intelligence sharing and analysis to the prosecution in the U.S. Attorney's offices, where federal grand juries and firm sentencing have the greatest impact on disrupting these gangs. The Senate has previously enacted legislation to accomplish this purpose, but it was never approved by the House. Senator McCaskill, you mentioned that sometimes we have an impossible job. My last recommendation, I urge Congress to act to balance citizens' rights to privacy with law enforcement's needs to lawfully monitor and intercept electronic communications regarding criminal activity and potential deadly plots. The expanding issue of going dark must be addressed at the federal level to afford local law enforcement and our federal partners the legislation and the tools they need to legally access encrypted communications that are used to coordinate criminal activities. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for the assistance that you provide law enforcement throughout our nation.
Thank you, Chief. And is it Manger?
Manger, yes.
Okay. Apologize for getting
50-50 shots.
2 out of 3 I was wrong. It's not unusual. Senator Langford has to leave, so I'll yield my position to Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you not only for being here for the preparation for this time, for the incredibly compelling testimony and the issues that you bring and the complexity of what you deal with every day. We appreciate your work very much. All three of you mentioned the interaction between MS-13 and what's happening in Central America. Several of you mentioned specifically the coordination efforts between Central America and law enforcement here, both federal and their law enforcement in that spot. What can we do to help facilitate greater cooperation, whether that be fingerprint sharing, identity, background information between individuals that are being deported here back there as they're trying to receive gang members back there, but also individuals that are moving this direction as well. So what coordination is missing? Because MS-13 obviously is a strong Central American, Salvador, and especially presence there. What can we do?
I would just say that you touched on a couple of things that we need to do. First, our ability to remove identified MS-13 gang members that have been arrested or convicted of crimes. Oftentimes we have, not only in Central America, but other nations in our world that will not accept their residents back, and we need to remove them from our country. And so if we can work on that issue, it would be very helpful. And as I mentioned in my testimony, that the truce that was in place between gangs in El Salvador and their government really did impact things in our country. And when that truce broke down, it had created a spike in violence in our country. So
what you're saying is that the gang truce broke down in El Salvador and it affected the violence directly here in the United States?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What other resources, what other cooperation do we need from Central American countries?
I had the privilege to just return from El Salvador, and with my position with the FBI's task force, I've been able to go down there approximately half of a dozen times. I just returned as recently as Saturday. The FBI has in place in El Salvador the TAG, the Transnational Anti-Gang Group. Their success prompted them to have another tag placed in Honduras and Guatemala. What I believe we're seeing up in the Metro Boston area is the inability to refer to a database that doesn't just cover local MS-13 members, but MS-13 members nationally as well as internationally. And I feel like a database that was, the input was from both El Salvador and the United States would assist in the vetting process of these unaccompanied children that are crossing the border. A lot of times in El Salvador, they have information that the individual may have gang ties, possibly not a member. And in return, in the United States, we have information that the individual has gang ties, whether or not he or she is a member. And it would be a great asset if that information found its way to a clearinghouse that they would have access to internationally and nationally, and even at the local level.
All three of you mentioned something along those lines. Is the FBI the correct depository for that? Because trying to set up something new, obviously, is an additional cost and bureaucracy and everything else. Is there enough of a relationship with the gang task forces locally with FBI and their gang task forces to say FBI should be tasked to be able to have this database, all local folks be able to have access to it, international and national?
In the Metro Boston area, which I can speak on with confidence, we speak to the FBI tag in Central America, specifically Guatemala and El Salvador, on a weekly basis. The Massachusetts State Police speaks to the FBI tag in El Salvador and Guatemala, maybe even more often than that. So it would be my opinion that the FBI already has in place those resources, and to expand those resources would probably be the best course.
Okay. Sini.
I agree wholeheartedly, as I mentioned in my testimony, that this database is a critical, mission critical to facilitating effective collaboration and eradicating these gangs from our communities here. What we're seeing for the first time on Long Island is direct connections with young gang members to El Salvador. So in the past, we've seen connections from gang members in Suffolk County and on Long Island to the West Coast. Now it's directly to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So your question is directly on point. In addition to the database, I would just add, we work very closely with the FBI in Suffolk County through the FBI Safe Streets Task Force. However, a broad special operation division may also be worth taking a look at. My understanding is that is essentially a multi-agency organization, and that could be a division that could assist in this type of database. What's very helpful is when we have a number pop in Suffolk County, a phone number, and we share that with our federal partners abroad who have assets in Central America, and the type of analysis and intelligence that they can gain from a single number is both scary when you see all the connections, but extremely helpful.
Okay, so what is missing in this database that doesn't already exist? Because it sounds like the cooperation is there, the relationships are already there. What's missing in this database? Is it just that it hasn't been launched? Because the information's there.
It's my opinion that we have a series of individual databases that don't always connect nationally and internationally, and I think it would be an asset to be able to connect them internationally, again, because that would assist with us not only knowing who's coming into our community, but also would assist the governments within Central America to know at times who's coming back. And from conversations with government officials in El Salvador, that was one of the things that they were struggling with, is that as their resources, to include the FBI's tag, address the MS problem locally in El Salvador, and they may arrest 20, 25 individuals, They said it's just a short time later that a plane arrives and 50 more gang members are brought back to their country, and they have to continue the process again. So it's important to address the problem in El Salvador if we're going to take a real hard look at the problem that we're experiencing here in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just a quick comment on this. This is something that the appropriations team has already started on. In fact, yesterday had a hearing on state and foreign ops appropriations about Central America specifically, and some of the investments and the way that we're targeting, how we're spending money in our foreign aid, and how we need to be able to target this, specifically dealing with violence in those areas, because it has an exact connection to what's happening here. I would encourage cooperation between those two committees and whatever we can do with the FBI to be able to help them finish out this database.
Yeah, it sounds to be pretty much a common solution here, so we'll work together with you on that. Senator McCaskill.
When you all identify a gang member who is in this country illegally, are you getting immediate response from ICE for deportation?
When we arrest them, we typically do. We can identify them. It's not until that they are arrested, fingerprinted, the fingerprints go, get to Homeland Security, that they identify them as someone they would be interested in, yes.
And let me ask about the countries who won't take them back. I mean, are we, and the problem that you just laid out very well with us, you know, just when El Salvador arrests 25 leaders, we send them 50 more to take their place back from this country. Have we had any problem with either Guatemala or El Salvador refusing to take any of the people that we have arrested for gang activity here to send back there that are not in this country legally?
I wouldn't be the subject matter expert to answer that question.
Have you all ever encountered not being able to get rid of a gang member that you're holding because a country won't receive them back? In Massachusetts, and specifically in the task force that I work in, we haven't had a problem. We don't know of a problem where the country didn't take them back. There have been roadblocks at times when an individual committed a crime and was placed in custody, up for deportation, and the federal judge refused the order of deportation. But that would be completely different than the country not taking them back. Right. That's a whole nother issue. I know you all have talked about money for regional task forces. I think this is one of those areas where we've got to be really careful with the budget the President presented, because while they're putting more money into border security, we can't forget that a lot of the HIDTA money, a lot of the money that burn grant money, I mean, you all know what these programs are because your departments depend on them, especially for interagency task forces. You know, having firsthand experience at this money is not wasted. This is not soft stuff. This is what's giving you the tools. So I just want to make that comment because the President's budget was not kind. The skinny budget and the new budget that's been presented was not always kind to programs like that. Let me ask you about prosecutors. You talked about, Commissioner Sini, about more line U.S. attorneys, and I get that RICO has tools that local prosecutors don't have within the RICO umbrella. But are you getting cooperation from local prosecutors on these assaults, on these felonies? I mean, is there not enough cooperation from your local DAs on this? Because all of these crimes, obviously, are state crimes, not federal crimes. Assault is not even a federal crime. Really, murder isn't either. So I'm just curious what the local cooperation has been.
So as I mentioned before, the part of our strategy is to target these gang members and make street arrests. And I mentioned we've made over 200 MS-13 arrests. The vast majority of those arrests are prosecuted by our local district attorney's office. So in that regard, we get excellent cooperation from the district attorney's office. Where I would improve the collaboration among the police department, U.S. Attorney's Office, and District Attorney's Office is oftentimes you're able to develop probable cause and the ability to arrest an individual on local state murder charges much sooner than you're able to make a federal murder RICO charge. So what I would like to see, if the machine was running perfectly, is once we have PC, once we have probable cause to make that state murder charge, the person is arrested, prosecuted in the state system. If it turns out that we're able to make that into a federal RICO charge, bring that case over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it's a collaborative effort. Perhaps you have a special assistant district attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office and a special assistant district attorney.
So it's coordinated.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Improved screening and post-placement services was also one of your recommendations. I certainly am aware of the post-placement services issue. We had a whole hearing, Senator Portman and I did, in PSI about the incredible problem of HHS not really, I mean, there has been some, put the gang issue aside, there has been some horrendous treatment of these children in terms of being forced into child labor and other issues, and clearly I think that's someplace that we need to continue to focus on that. Let me finally just ask you, it's my understanding, Commissioner and Chief, that neither one of your departments will be participating in 287G, is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you explain briefly why you will not be participating in 287G?
So although we believe that it's mission critical to collaborate with the Department of Homeland Security to remove dangerous gang members from our streets, we also simultaneously have to create an environment in which undocumented individuals feel comfortable coming to law enforcement with information about crimes. So therefore, we do not, for example, inquire into the immigration status of those individuals who are coming to the police as a witness, as a victim, or someone merely seeking police assistance. In the same vein, we believe if we entered into a 287G agreement, that could compromise our mission in creating that environment and could hurt our ability to make cases, to encourage witnesses and victims to come forward. With that said, whenever we arrest an individual for a crime, misdemeanor or felony, and that person is not here legally, we automatically notify the Department of Homeland Security. So,
and Chief Manger, your department was listed on ICE's jurisdictions that supposedly didn't cooperate with them. You know, obviously, what the Commissioner just described is the ultimate cooperation. It's paying attention to your public safety mission, which has to be foremost. You're the only one that answers 911 calls. I'm not aware of anybody else in the entire criminal justice system that answers 911 calls besides your departments. And so what was the downfall of you being listed as a department that failed to cooperate with ICE, and what was the impact on your ability to, in fact, put criminals in prison?
We, the biggest challenge that I've had is to try and make sure that what a number of our elected officials have said has not been misinterpreted by our federal colleagues. The fact is we are not now, nor have we ever been, a sanctuary jurisdiction. We have found, we believe, because as I mentioned, that Montgomery County is 1/3 immigrant when you look at our population. And I think the Commissioner described it perfectly. We've got to find that balance for what's right for public safety in our jurisdiction. If people are afraid to come forward and report crime, afraid to come forward to be witnesses to crime, our jurisdiction is less safe. So we've found that balance. We don't inquire about people's immigration status. However, if we arrest someone, we cooperate fully with ICE. We respond to every one of their inquiries. The issue where I think many jurisdictions run into the challenge, and we've been talking to Homeland Security about this forever, are the issue of the detainers. And I think many people look at the issue of whether we honor a detainer or not, that is, hold someone beyond when they would normally be released, as a political decision. It is not. It is a legal decision. We have been instructed by the Federal Circuit, Fourth Circuit. We have been given instructions by our attorneys that we can hold these folks until the time when they would be released. At that point, we will notify ICE they're being released. If ICE can come down and get them, they're welcome to them. We will notify ICE when they're going to be. We'll give them notice ahead of time when they're going to be released if we have that information. We had a case recently that ICE took the opportunity to put a press release out on saying that Montgomery County released a dangerous person back into the community. It was a mistake. We had a detainer. We should have honored it. It was unexpected that a judge was going to release this person, and we didn't notify ICE. So when I say we, it was our corrections department. And it was a mistake. It was fixed the next day. The person was taken into custody the next day.
But that doesn't overcome the press release.
It does not overcome. But the fact of the matter is, we are doing the same thing that Suffolk County is doing, the same thing that about 90+% of the 18,000 police departments in this country are doing. We have found that balance where we do not want to be the immigration police, but we absolutely cooperate and help our federal partners.
And make no mistake, you guys are handling 95% of the violent crime that occurs in this country, not the federal authorities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll take Senator Langford's question, then it'll be Senator Hassan. On that same line of questioning, is there any federal law that you'd want to see changed or modified to help you do your job as it relates to this gang activity and your dealing with the ICE in terms of detainers and immigration law?
I would love to see, you know, we're bound by case law, and when we're informed that by our attorneys that we would be liable for false imprisonment if we do not release someone when they are entitled to be released, that's a problem. And so if there can be a change in the law that give those detainers the strength of a warrant, because if we have a warrant, we will hold someone. And that is, I believe, that the easiest solution is to get a warrant to hold somebody. That gives us the legal authority to do so.
So again, you're concerned about your liability. I've heard the same thing in terms of county sheriff's departments in Wisconsin as well. There's some civil cases out there that hold them liable if they detain people. So it's really giving you that liability protection if you actually detain people in this country illegally.
That's correct. And believe me, there's not a police department in this country that doesn't want to hold someone who is a danger to their community. And if we can use that person who has already committed a crime that has gotten them locked up in the first place, if we can use deportation as a tool for that individual, I'm perfectly happy to remove that person from my community. But I cannot run afoul of the law in doing that.
So I'm going to come back to the strategy of using deportation versus arresting and imprisonment. But I first want to get to something pretty basic. It was interesting being briefed for this. I've not been a prosecutor. I haven't been involved in the whole issue of gangs. My assumption going in is that MS-13 we've been primarily there as drug traffickers, human traffickers. Kind of splitting this out, the reason people join gangs, we've talked about, they don't have people here, they don't have family here, this is the type of family, but they're also extorted to join the gang as well. Can you just tell me, what is the purpose of MS-13? I mean, from the gang's perspective, why are they recruiting, why are they extorting, what is their main activity? I'll start with you, Commissioner.
Sure. They recruit to sustain themselves, and they are a criminal organization, and their main objective is to exist and to be feared. And there's no question that they engage in criminal economic activity. Many of them sell drugs. Many of them commit extortion, robberies, burglaries. But they don't engage in that. They don't engage in those criminal activities as their primary purpose of existence.
Do you understand how that's just surprising? I mean, to hear that, their main purpose is just to exist, to be an entity, to have people loyal to them, and the loyalty extends to macheting people to death. And does everybody else agree with that? Is that the main purpose?
Just to add to what the Commissioner said, we have to look at MS-13 in the United States as it evolves. Just like we have to look at MS-13 in El Salvador as it evolved. On the East Coast of the United States, MS-13 is just getting a foothold. On the West Coast of the United States, like Senator McCaskill and Senator Johnson have said, they've been there for decades. And we actually imported MS-13 back to El Salvador. But now they have begun to evolve, and on the West Coast, they do control drug trafficking markets. They do have connections with other criminal organizations, such as the Mexican Mafia, La MA. In El Salvador, almost everybody pays. Almost everybody pays some sort of extortion payment to MS-13. In some cases, it might be as little as $1. But when a household in El Salvador might only bring in $250, that $1 is pretty significant. So we need to learn from the patterns of MS-13 on the West Coast and the patterns of the criminal activity of MS-13 in El Salvador to be prepared for what MS-13 is ultimately going to try to put into place in the East Coast. So to piggyback what the Commissioner said, as of right now, they are just maintaining. And they really do just go out and commit the most heinous of violent acts, some of which, as a 22-year investigator, I've never investigated before, to include cutting off of limbs, the attempt to cut off a victim's head with a machete. So at this moment on the East Coast and in Boston, like the Commissioner said, some of them are employed. Some of them go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you go into certain restaurants in Boston to arrest an MS-13 member, sometimes the business owner says, he was one of my best workers. So right now, they're maintaining, they're getting their numbers up, and we can see that from the Metro Boston area all the way down to Charlotte. But they are going to evolve, and they are going to attempt to take over trafficking markets of narcotics, just like they have in the West Coast and just like they have in Central America.
So again, they have different specialties. In El Salvador, it's extortion. In the West Coast, it is drug trafficking. And we're not quite sure how it evolves. You would suspect it'd be drug trafficking, human trafficking.
I believe on the East Coast, they're still trying to get leadership into the right places, to include Boston, Long Island, Virginia, the Carolinas. And I think once they establish that leadership base, you will start to see a more sophisticated gang that doesn't just solely commit violent acts, but also controls some sort of narcotics market and possibly even illegal trafficking.
So let me ask how they differ and how they are similar with other major gangs. Maybe Chief Manger can answer that.
Our neighborhood crews, which are not ethnic based, that is, they are more diverse in terms of their membership. They are the ones that typically have, when we have homicides relating to those, it's usually drug related. The homicides related to MS-13, it's just because we can and because we will and because we want to instill that fear. It's because if you're not in my gang, then you're my enemy and I'm going to kill you. The economic support that MS-13 was engaged in was very unsophisticated for a long time. It was, we're going to rent an apartment in some old apartment building, and we're going to put a couple of young women in there and get, $20, for every guy that wants to come in. And this would operate for about a week. And when it would finally come to our attention, we'd be able to shut that down. It would just pop up somewhere else. Not very sophisticated. And it was usually, they were extorting money and making money from unlawful operations. Now they're going to Latino-owned businesses and charging them rent. And they're using coercion, fear, threats, and threats that the victims know that these people have the ability and willingness to carry out, to now extort money from legitimate business. This is a trend that we're seeing more recently.
Real quick, because I did just want to ask you, you talked about the instance of a couple individuals lured through the internet to their deaths. Was that an initiation right? I mean, why would they lure individuals on just to kill them?
In one case, it was because they believed that that individual was part of a rival gang.
Okay.
In another case, it was that this individual had been approached and had been resistant to joining MS-13, so it was basically to teach them a lesson. No more reason than that.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for this hearing. And first of all, to the three of you, thank you for your service as law enforcement officers, and please thank your families for all of us, too. I'm the former governor of New Hampshire, and I had the great privilege of being the chief executive over the New Hampshire State Police. So I am very appreciative of the time, effort, commitment that you all provide to your fellow citizens. And I'm very grateful for your testimony today. I'm very grateful for not only for the information, but the suggestions and recommendations. I think they will help all of us as we work together to combat this gang and other public safety threats. I did want to look at or delve into a little bit more some of the discussion of what we think the root causes of gang violence are. We know we have to ensure that our federal, state, and local law enforcement officers have the resources necessary to keep our communities safe, and I thank you for your recommendations in that regard. But to touch on something that Commissioner Sini talked about a little bit, having a strong law enforcement presence in our communities is only really one part of the solution. We have to ensure, too, that there are social and education programs in place and that those are adequately resourced to try to divert young people away from joining gangs in the first place. So in my state, one of the important social programs that has helped us to address youth violence was a mentorship program between police and students. It's known as MPAL. Paired cops with kids in a mentorship capacity in order to help kids grow, make the right choices, and become productive members of the community. Among other things, they teach the kids boxing, how to exercise, how to work out. And it's been an important tool to combat gang recruitment and crime, but also to combat drug abuse as well, which you know is a particularly devastating issue in my state. So I want to ask you all about the social and educational programs in your communities and how they seek to address some of the root causes of gang violence. And also just wanted your thoughts on what we saw from the President's budget yesterday, which has eliminated federal support for key education programs such as dropout prevention and after-school support activities. I assume that you think federal dollars for this kind of work is important, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. And maybe, Commissioner, we could start with you.
Sure. So that is a critical piece to addressing this significant public safety issue. And in Suffolk County, our police officers, they do such fantastic work in terms of mentoring our students, our children in the communities, and doing outreach to all of our children, but particularly our at-risk youth. And so we do that in a variety of different forms. We do it directly with police officers. We also have launched a new program called Change, which is with the Department of Probation and a not-for-profit organization that specializes in gang prevention. And the idea is early intervention, trying to identify at-risk children early on to connect them to services that they may need, whether it's social work services, psychological counseling, medical services, and providing that support so that they can do well in our communities, and also involving the family, because that's key. The family is going to have the biggest impact on this child's life, so there needs to be an approach to involve the family in that process. And involving law enforcement in these social programs is critical for several reasons. One, police officers tend to be just very, they're very warm and very intelligent and charismatic individuals, and they tend to be good at this. Yeah. But also it creates that trust between law enforcement and the community. So to the extent that people are not comfortable with law enforcement, mentoring programs like the one you launched in your home state help break those barriers. So it also achieves that objective. And I just add that in terms of early intervention, what better place to start than with the unaccompanied children, because we know they're coming over and they are at risk. They are vulnerable by nature of coming to this country illegally, not being with their parents, being so young, being new to this country, and to identify them early on would be key, which is why notification to local governments, I think, would be very helpful. And yes, I vehemently support federal dollars for community policing.
Thank you very much. Detective?
I'll be brief. I feel that the two gentlemen to the left and right of me are in a position to speak on policy better than I am. But I will tell you, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, my chief, Brian Keyes, has always said, if we're reacting to a crisis, then we've already lost.
Yeah.
We need to be proactive and prevent the crisis. Yeah. And in Chelsea, we have many programs that especially addressing the unaccompanied children, whether it be after-school programs that involves policing, whether it's the Massachusetts General Hospital in Chelsea that provides social resources to these children. Like the commissioner said, you have to involve the family. You can't take a 15-year-old and think that 30 minutes after school playing basketball is going to have a lasting effect. It may open up some doors for a relationship.
Right.
But once that door is open, you need to find out where that individual is going home to. Because we can spend all day playing basketball, but where's that 15-year-old going home to? And as law enforcement agents, it's our job to know where that 12, 13, 14-year-old individual is going home to.
Yeah.
And so we spend a lot of time. I probably spend just as much time fighting gangs as I do trying to spend time with individuals in Chelsea, preventing them from joining the gangs in the first place. So you have to get the families involved. And when it comes to this unaccompanied children, it's important to help us identify what the crisis is. Right. A lot of these individuals are coming here across the border, and they already have PTSD setting in. Just the crossing in and of itself,
right,
we've heard horror stories about. One of the important things that I think would greatly help the state of Massachusetts, and specifically my community, Chelsea, is that if we knew, if there was some sort of notification that came to the police department or it came to the city that an unaccompanied minor was about to join your community.
Yeah.
So that way that we can search them out to offer resources versus them trying to have to seek us out. Right. And lastly, when it comes to MS-13, inherently, they're not very trusting of the government.
Right.
And a lot of the social programs that we have in Chelsea to include what's called ROCA, reaching out to Chelsea adolescents, the MS-13 members see that as a government agency. They don't know that's a social agency. So it does hinder their ability to do reach-out work. But just in closing, the proactive approach, the reach-out work, preventing these individuals from joining the gang at the recruitment stage is critical.
Thank you. Chief?
Every single one of us, when we were 12, 13 years old, you start to sort of mature out of, always being under, mom and dad's umbrella, and you want to have, every one of us want a sense of belonging to something, a sense of being able to be somewhere where we had people that cared about us, friends. For some of us, it was sports. Some of us, it was other school activities. Some of us, church. The unaccompanied minors that come here are just a perfect recruitment opportunity for gangs because they come with none of that, but they all want that.
Right.
And so the key, I think, is to be able to, as soon as possible, when we identify those folks, is to give them the wraparound services. And I'm telling you, Scott is right on, and I wrote down, walking home. Because we can do all we can for these kids, but then they got to walk home,
right,
and that's where they're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And the early intervention programs, the intervention programs, we have something called a street outreach network, where we have counselors who are specially trained, many of them former gang members, who actually intervene with these kids, help them get out of the gangs, if possible, keep them from joining gangs in the first place. The challenge, I think, is to identify these kids, and the one place where these kids will all end up that you might be able to connect with them is schools.
Yeah.
And the problem is the schools are hesitant, and I understand this, why they're hesitant. They're hesitant to get involved in the gang issue.
Right.
But that's where you can actually find these kids. But the schools have been reluctant, understandably, to start getting involved in those gang kind of programs. But if we can somehow coordinate a little bit better without running afoul of all the protections that are in place for these young kids, that's what the early intervention is the way to go. Absolutely.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, thank you for your indulgence. Gentlemen, thank you all very much, and be safe.
Sure. By the way, I just have to chime in, talking about if you're dealing with a crisis, you're already too late. The primary goal, I believe, of federal policy should be to stop the flow or drastically reduce it. I mean, if we focus on that, then you're not having to worry about dealing with all these unaccompanied children, because it's been a crisis level. It's creating all kinds of havoc. So our focus ought to be on how do we stop or dramatically reduce that flow. Senator Hassan. Senator Harris.
Thank you. Chairman, as Attorney General of California, I convened a group of law enforcement leaders in our state and other experts over quite some period of time to produce this report, Gangs Beyond Borders, and it's an examination of transnational criminal organizations and what we need to do to stop them. I'd like to submit that for the record.
Without objection. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I want to thank each of you. As a career prosecutor, I started out as a baby DA, and I've prosecuted personally everything from low-level offenses to homicides. I was the elected DA of San Francisco and Attorney General of California. And I cannot thank you each enough for the work you do, in particular as local law enforcement. Perhaps it's a bit of my bias, but I do know that local law enforcement disproportionately shoulders the burden and responsibility for dealing with these issues, including transnational criminal organizations. And it is too bad that others, when we talk about transnational criminal organizations, they automatically go to international law enforcement or federal, when in fact local law enforcement really does carry an extreme burden for dealing with it at the local level. So I want to thank each of you and the men and women of your departments for the work they do. So as local law enforcement, we know that transnational criminal organizations, and it's in the report also, certainly they're involved in the trafficking of guns and drugs and human beings. They also, like everyone else in society, have adopted technology in the way they do their work. Among their many reasons for being, the chairman asked that question, is one of the highest reasons for being is to make money. But they profit off of illegal activities that rise to the level of also being lethal. And so they are also involved in money laundering. They're involved in government fraud. They're involved in piracy. They're involved in identity fraud. All of those are pursuits of illegal and organized criminal associations. So, but as local law enforcement, one of the things that we know is that one of the best tools that we have is the trust that we have between ourselves and the communities we serve. And when there is a break in that trust, it breaks our ability to do the work that we need to do and the men and women of your departments need to do, which is to concern themselves with public safety. So I'd like to talk for a moment about that, the importance of the relationship of trust between local law enforcement and the communities you police. You are aware that this administration has been looking at a policy of withholding burn JAG and COPS funding, federal funding, to local law enforcement if you don't cooperate with immigration enforcement. We've talked about that previously. First, tell me, how much do your departments rely on burn JAG and COPS funding to do your everyday work? Can you tell me, and each of you, if we can just go down the line?
Sure. We are a recipient of burn grant money in excess of $1 million, and it helps us fulfill many of our mission-critical objectives.
And if that funding were withheld, what would that mean in terms of your ability to perform your everyday duties and responsibilities?
We would have to secure funding from another location, which in these days in my county, that would be extremely challenging.
Okay, thank you.
I would mirror what the commissioner said. My department relies greatly on that funding, and if that funding was taken away, it would seriously inhibit our ability to do what we do every day.
Thank you.
Ditto. We typically have around $1 million at any given time of that kind of grant money. The programs that we operate based on that money are absolutely critical to our mission and are doing phenomenal things for the residents of our county. My hope is that there is beginning to we're getting more clarity as to what a sanctuary jurisdiction is and what would make jurisdiction ineligible for these kinds of grants. As we get that clarity, I think that my concern is lessening a little bit, because in nowhere did I see that a place like Suffolk County or Montgomery County would have to change what we're doing. We do, in fact, cooperate with federal authorities, but again, but the fact that we've elected not to become 287G jurisdictions and do immigration enforcement ourselves would not make us ineligible for those kinds of grants. So I'm hopeful that as we get more clarity, that it won't impact the majority of jurisdictions.
Thank you, Chief. And on your point about your department's statement to your community that you will not be a 287G, a city and department, let's talk a little bit about, again, the relationship of trust as it relates to what we ultimately want to do, which is not just arrest the bad guy, but prosecute him and get a conviction and lock him up. What we want to do is we want to make sure that there's going to be serious and swift and severe accountability and consequence, in particular for those who commit violent crimes in our community. As we both know, the only way that we get to that goal is that we prove a case in a court of law. And the only way we're going to prove a case in a court of law is if we present evidence to a jury or a judge, correct? And most of the time, that evidence is not going to be coming from the bad guy himself. It's going to be because we have produced witnesses to the crime who will come and testify before a jury in an open courtroom. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And wouldn't you agree then that what has happened over the course of many months since these statements have been made about a policy that would have local law enforcement cooperate with ICE is that there has been a chilling effect, in particular around witnesses who are immigrants, be they documented or undocumented?
Certainly when the executive orders were first issued right after the new administration came into office, there was absolutely a great fear in our community about just how those executive orders were going to be implemented.
And you mentioned you're the head of the police chiefs.
Of the major city chiefs,
yes. And thank you for that. So you probably know Chief Charlie Beck in Los Angeles.
Very well, yes.
So Chief Beck has reported that in March he witnessed a 25% drop in reports of sexual assault, a 10% drop in reports of domestic violence among Latinos in Los Angeles from the same time in 2016. Similar reports have come from Houston, Texas, and Salt Lake. Would you agree that when the people of our communities think that they're going to be deported, many victims, in fact, especially, will endure crimes like domestic violence or sexual assault rather than be deported and removed from their children or the community that they know? I
do believe that, and when we were very quickly aware of the fear in our community, and we redoubled our efforts to ensure to let the folks in our community know that our policy has not changed.
That's great.
And that they had no reason to fear coming forward to report crimes or being witnesses. And I'll just tell you a very quick story. We had a domestic homicide where a man driving down a busy street had abducted his estranged wife, and she tried to jump out of the car. He grabbed her by the hair, pulled her back in, shot her in the head, and then pushed her out onto the street. There were two men who were within the distance that you and I are away from where this happened. They heard her scream, they heard the shot, they saw what occurred. Both these men were day laborers. They were standing in a parking lot at a convenience store waiting to be picked up for work. Neither men spoke English. I don't know their immigration status, but people can certainly, speculate. As we arrived, these men came forward and spoke to one of my officers about what they saw. And had we not had the relationship with the community we have and the policies that we have, my guess is that both of these men would not have been there when officers arrived to start investigating that case.
Thank you. Thank you all for your service. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, we're all announcing our street cred on this. I, too, was the Attorney General of my state, like General Harris, and I had the wonderful opportunity of leading teams in drug enforcement, which inevitably led to gang enforcement. And it was very difficult sometimes for people in a state like North Dakota to understand that gangs had infiltrated their community. I think sometimes one of the challenges we have in states, unlike California, is getting people to admit they actually have a problem. I don't think there's any doubt that MS-13 has become a cancer in our society, and that it's metastasizing in every community, including communities in my state, especially Native American communities where it's easier to infiltrate. I will tell you, like any cancer, we need a whole range of treatments. You know, if you get breast cancer, you can't just rely on surgery. You're going to have chemotherapy, you're going to have radiation, you're going to have after treatment. And so I want to focus, as my colleague, Senator Hassan, focused on prevention, and Senator Harris focused on what we need to do to actually have prosecutions. I want to talk about deportations. Through an interesting set of circumstances, actually spent about an hour and a half, 2 hours in an El Salvadorian prison with leaders of MS-13. They rely on those gang leaders to maintain some kind of order within the prison system, because otherwise the overcrowding, there's no way they could maintain that population. And so you see MS-13 basically embedded throughout the culture and throughout the society, the civil society of these communities. I also, in San Salvador, went to a religious-based anti-gang program, where a lot of it was job training, a lot of it was trying to find opportunities so that future gang members or people who were just on the cusp of recruitment could find an opportunity other than joining the gang for economic stability in their lives. Now, with that said, I will tell you the biggest problem I see is extortion. And when you deport a gang leader, an MS-13 gang leader, back to the community, they're going to find a family member, and they're going to extort. And all the great wishes and outreach that you're talking about today may not be all that valuable if they think that if they don't join in this country, that the grandmother will not be alive the next day. And so the extortion piece of this is incredibly difficult to get at. And I think we cannot solve this problem without thinking about stabilizing the Triangle countries, especially the country of El Salvador. They are still suffering from the residuals of a civil war that created the vacuum in terms of security and safety that gangs moved into, and there's never been, in my opinion, a very effective reestablishment of the rule of law, and they act in that way. Senator Johnson and I also, Chairman Johnson and I also witnessed some of the collaborations between our institutions, and we actually saw the Colombian folks come up and try and help to establish rule of law and order in these communities. My question to all of you, and then I'll just let you take it from here, when you are arresting or when you're dealing with the community, how much of this do you hear, and have you thought about if only, we could have a program in El Salvador, if only we could work more collaboratively with our counterparts in the Triangle countries, particularly El Salvador, we could get a better handle on what's happening here. How much thinking have you done about international collaboration, I guess would be my question.
To answer that, I just wanted to touch base on what Senator Harris, what you were asking. In my community, which is the majority of the community identifies with Hispanic or Latino, trust with law enforcement is priority number one. A lot of our community is made up of undocumented residents, and so trust with that sub-community is priority number one. And we've gone through great lengths to assure them that, yes, Since January, ICE has had more of a presence in our neighborhoods, but the Chelsea Police Department doesn't assist ICE operations when they're solely for immigration issues.
I can appreciate that one of the challenges that you have is just within the community writ large, where you are. But it's going to be really hard to convince that kid not to join a gang and not to act the way they're going to act if they think that their parents or if they think that their grandparents are at risk back home in El Salvador.
Right, and that's
so
a
how do we solve that?
And that's a true statement. We do have evidence of individuals being pressured into joining gangs because of some sort of tie direct with El Salvador. I think, Senator, I think you said it at the beginning of your question, which was we need to secure, we need to stabilize those countries. They're fleeing for a reason. And when they do, they're coming to this country under the worst possible conditions. So like yourself, I've been to many of the jails and prisons in El Salvador, and they have resources that are minimal at best. And so there's no reason for that individual to actually attempt to reform while they're in prison. They're just looking to get out and just go right back to where they were before they went in. So to answer you directly, yes, we need to make an effort to assist those Central American countries, specifically El Salvador, where I've been, in stabilizing.
Mm-hmm. From the standpoint of the chiefs of police, how do you see an opportunity to collaborate with your counterparts in the Triangle countries, particularly El Salvador?
It's a challenge. I mean, we certainly have partnered with our international partners. 10 of our members are from our police departments from Canada. We've had associate members from the UK. The relationship between law enforcement agencies, especially our federal partners, and the law enforcement agencies of some of these countries is we got to build the trust there. Yeah. You have to be able to trust that that information that you're sharing is not going to be misused. There is no question that the premise of your remarks that there's an impact on what goes on here by what's happening there. Unfortunately, as a local police chief, even as you know, the president of major city chiefs, I'm not sure local law enforcement has much control or much influence over the issue that you're asking about.
And I think my point would be that then we're just treating symptoms, because we aren't going to get ahead of this unless we work collaboratively. And I completely understand the hesitation to share intelligence or any kind of information back and forth. You don't know who you're talking to. And I think these are all efforts that we're working on to try and improve the professionalism and the honesty and integrity of the police departments. We've seen some steps in the right direction. They definitely are not there. But I still, like Senator Harris and like Senator Hassan, I understand the critical role that local law enforcement plays. And when we make mistakes here in terms of national policy and national cooperation and the utilization of the resources we have in this country, when we don't do our job internationally, you guys are going to continue to be stressed and have this same issue. And so I just wanted to bring that, because I think a lot of people think, well, deport them home. Deporting people home may in fact be sending one of the worst perpetrators, who now has the ability to extort any number of additional people to achieve a criminal result right here in the United States. So thank you so much for everything that you do. We want to be great partners with you, and thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Senator Daines, good timing.
Thank you. Precision like the Blue Angels here, huh? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for testifying today and for your service in the law enforcement community. You all mentioned brutal crimes in your testimony. These are hard to stomach. We just had a very brutal crime in Montana last week where we had a deputy sheriff that was murdered by a man who was eventually killed by law enforcement. We had the funeral yesterday. We need to do everything in our power to put an end to the violence and cut off the flow of resources that fuel it. In Montana, while we do not have a sizable transnational criminal organization presence, we do feel the impacts of their illicit activities. MS-13 has established relationships with drug trafficking networks that distribute in Montana. Virtually all meth in Montana are trafficked from south of the border. We have seen the price drop in half with the influx, and now more than 90% of all drug offenses in Montana are meth-related. Additionally, we've seen a nearly 5-fold increase in heroin-positive drug tests. This impacts our communities, from increases in violent crime to a disturbing rise in child endangerment and foster care caseloads. Detective Connelly, at previous hearings with Homeland Security Secretary Kelly, we discussed domestic demand for drugs as a key contributor to the violence in Central America. I understand you recently returned from El Salvador, training their police. From your perspective, how can we reinforce their law enforcement efforts?
While I was down there, I had an opportunity to speak to high-ranking officials within their law enforcement community. And what they said over and over again was that what they were experiencing in El Salvador was the sophistication of a gang member that was coming back from the United States. Just recently in El Salvador, they started doing Title III wiretaps. Up until 2015, they didn't even have the ability to do that. In El Salvador, what they need most in regards to combating the MS-13 and their rival 18th Street gang is not just the technology, but the personnel that knows how to utilize that technology. But most importantly, and I know the Department of Justice has gone through great lengths to provide this, training for their prosecutors. A lot of their prosecutors didn't have the adequate training to prosecute a sophisticated gang like MS-13 or 18th Street. When I was down there about not just this most recent time, but a couple of years ago, we found that their homicide detectives didn't do homicide investigations, that for the most part, just responded, wrote a report, and then moved on to the next homicide. So to answer your question directly, training. Training is what they need. They want to combat the gang. El Salvadorians that live in El Salvador, they despise the MS-13 gang just as much as El Salvadorans that live in Massachusetts. They despise the gang and they applaud all efforts to rid their area of the gang. But to answer your question, training.
So follow-up, what else do you think these countries could be doing to stop the production of meth, to stop the production of these other drugs before they're even shipped to the U.S.?
I think I'd be outside of my scope of expertise if I was to answer that. I'm sure that the same techniques that we would use here in the United States. I mean, it would require a joint approach, a joint effort to totally stop the traffic of narcotics.
Commissioner Sini, in your testimony, you discussed the surge to over 400 MS-13 gang members in your county in just a few years. How in the world did that happen?
Well, these are identified gang members in Suffolk County in a handful of hamlets. These individuals certainly comprise of mostly males. They are mostly Latino, coming from countries such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Many of them came to the country illegally. A small percentage of them are unaccompanied children, and a small percentage are also lawful residents and even American citizens. Certainly, we are concerned that MS-13 is recruiting younger people. As we target them, they recruit even younger. And as we mentioned earlier, the unaccompanied children are certainly vulnerable for MS-13 gang recruitment, and that's why it's so important to address that population.
So speaking of gangs, and I hail from a state that has a number of Indian reservations. I'm told by state law enforcement that gangs often find Indian reservations to be a safe haven. Do you have any thoughts, and I'll open this up to the panel, do you have any thoughts on how we can boost collaboration with the tribal communities and law enforcement?
Suffolk County has reservations in its jurisdiction, and we've had issues involving crime, particularly gangs, on our reservations. In one instance, what we've done is we've entered into a memorandum of understanding with the tribe to essentially provide police services to that reservation. There are obviously very complex issues involving jurisdiction and sovereign territory, and that memorandum of understanding set forth clear terms upon consent with the reservation and the tribe to accept police services. That document has gone a long way in improving relations between the Native Americans living on that reservation and the Suffolk County Police Department, and we've been able to collaborate with the tribal council to target those criminals, because how long ago did you put that MOU in place? The MOU has been in place for several years.
And have you seen your actual results?
Yes, absolutely, because we're able then to work hand in hand with the tribal council to target problem individuals and problem locations, because there's no arguing and there's no debating about whose role it is, who's allowed to be there, when are we allowed to be there. So it facilitates that collaboration, and we have an excellent relationship with the tribal council on the reservation with which we have that MOU. And just like we would work with a town or a municipality where we partner with their code enforcement and their public safety to target, say, a problem home. We have zombie homes in Suffolk County, these abandoned homes, or a problem location like a drug spot. We do that with the reservation, and it's very effective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Just to give you a little further insight on your opening line of questions in terms of the law enforcement in Central America, when we were down there, one of the biggest problems they have, first of all, they're combating impunity and corruption. When I first heard that, kind of impunity, that's a different term, but then you find out that local law enforcement has provided a not so subtle threat when they're given a DVD showing their families going to church or their children going to school. So that's a pretty brutal reminder of why it's pretty tough being local law enforcement down in Central America. Senator Homeland, further evidence that we are strong on we're committed to securing our northern border. Well represented on our committee. You're next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you hearing on this important issue. And I guess I'd start out by asking each of you, what are we doing? What's Customs and Border Patrol doing at the border, particularly in regard to unaccompanied alien children, to make sure that we're trying to prevent the growth of MS-13? In other words, looking at people who may be trying to come across to join MS-13 in this country. And what's the average age for MS-13 gang members? So in Suffolk County, the median age of recent MS-13, I should say active MS-13, based on our arrests, is 18. And it certainly ranges from the largest age range for active MS-13 gang members is 14 to 29. And certainly there are younger MS-13 gang members and older, but that's our biggest bulk. In terms of what Department of Homeland Security is doing, my understanding is they are transferring responsibility over to the Department of Health and Human Services at an early stage. And I think, I'll speak for Suffolk County, what we would like to see is more collaboration
between local governments and the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Refugee Resettlement in terms of the placement of these children in our communities, including notification to school districts and local governments so that we can be proactive in dealing with this very vulnerable population.
Well, and also the immigration courts, because if unaccompanied alien children, particularly in, say, young males in that 14, 15 to 18 age bracket, if they're being released into the community, then doesn't that create a real concern that some of those may get recruited and end up as MS-13 gang members?
Yes, and we've seen that some of them have. Now, it's still a very small percentage of the UAC population, but nonetheless, it's of concern to us, which is why we think local notification and funding to provide services to these children is so important.
Where is MS-13 drawing their ranks from? I mean, you talked about significant growth. Where are they drawing that growth from? Where's it coming from?
They're recruiting young people in our communities, and they're recruiting recent immigrants because oftentimes they prey on people's fears. So recent immigrants may not feel comfortable coming to law enforcement. They are adjusting to a new culture and society, so they are vulnerable at that point. And they're recruiting also very young. There's one instance where in Suffolk County we have intelligence of MS-13 gang members recruiting a 10-year-old.
And what's the draw?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. There's the draw that you can belong to something. We can put some money in your pocket. You can get high with us. You'll have a family. We'll protect you. There's a sense of cultural unity as well. And then there's the other part. By the way, if you don't join, you're going to have problems. So there's the fear factor as well, the coercion, if you will.
I guess the same questions.
I just wanted to add to what the commissioner said. I can tell you in my community, if you're a 17-year-old El Salvadorian that just arrived in the Massachusetts area as a UAC, all you've ever known is MS-13 and 18th Street back home. From childhood, that's all you've ever known. They control complete city blocks, multiple city blocks. They control multiple cities. So a lot of times when that child comes here and they're confronted under, like we spoke about a few times, under the worst possible conditions, and they have one individual come up to them and even speak about MS-13 or 18th Street, that child goes right back to what he or she knows, which is what MS-13 is in El Salvador. And they know that once that contact has been made, that they only have really one choice, and that is to join. Now, we've had success with individuals resisting at the beginning of that recruitment process. And locally, I'm talking about success locally, we've had success with having that individual resist that gang recruitment. And then actually the gang at some point kind of leaves them alone, because a lot of times MS-13 is only looking for individuals that want to be MS-13. But under the UAC program, a lot of these individuals were coming to homes that didn't want them, a parent that didn't want them. At sometimes we've even had interviews done with individuals that didn't want to be here, that their grandparents said, we've raised you long enough, it's time for you to go live with your mom. And then the worst case scenario, the sponsorship program, where there wasn't any vetting taking place. And we have horrific stories of individuals living in the worst of conditions. And like everyone on this panel has said in our opening briefs, that is the classic vulnerable 15-year-old individual that seeks out the identity of the gang in replace for a broken family structure. Just one more point. I can't comment on what goes on at the border, but I can tell you from a local law enforcement perspective, like the commissioner said, if we had some sort of notification that came to the community, and I'm not sure how that notification would be made, so that when the individual comes here, that they have resources provided to them, whether it be through the schools, whether it be through mental health. But the worst case scenario is the scenario that we're living right now, where we get notified from the school that 38 new students just arrived from Central America. Some are thriving and some are not. And those are only the ones that we can identify because they're seeking out education through the schools or social services through medical facilities. So it would greatly assist local law enforcement if some sort of notification was done, especially when we're talking about 13, 14, and 15-year-old kids.
Well, and that actually goes right to my next question is, are our laws sufficient to try to deal with the MS-13 problem? Sounds like right there is something that would be helpful, and that is some type of notification requirement for people coming across the border as to, you know, address where are you going, and that law enforcement would be one of the entities at least notified so that you're aware. I mean, we'd have to give some thought how to do it. But that would be my question is, are our laws sufficient so that you can try to deal with this problem?
I think that our criminal laws are sufficient in terms of dealing with criminal behavior by gangs. Where I think we need help, and I don't know whether it's new laws or different laws, but it's if our Health and Human Services folks, they are notified in my jurisdiction, they have somehow they're notified when we get these unaccompanied minors that are sent to our jurisdiction. But Detective Connelly's mention about oftentimes these kids, they say that I'm going to my uncle's house, this is where my uncle lives, they verify that. What they don't do is get enough information about whether the uncle is even capable of taking this person in. And then what happens when the uncle does say, okay, I'll take them, and 2 weeks later says, this is not working, we can't do this. Where are the wraparound services to help that family, to help that child, that individual? And this is, we need perhaps better standards in place to make sure that whatever situation we're sending that person to, it's viable and viable for a long, some longer period of time.
Thank you. Thanks for your work.
Thanks, Senator Hoeven. Again, I just want to thank the witnesses for taking the time for your testimony, for your thoughtful answers to our questions, but primarily, thank you for your service. I mean, we all know the risks you're taking. We all have, I'm sure, in our states, people, police officers, other public safety officials that have given their lives in the line of duty. So we understand that and truly, truly appreciate your service. With that, the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until June 8 at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.